wabarakatuh. Good evening. My name is Muhammad. I'm 80 years old. I have two questions. First, according to the World Democracy Index, our country is named as a flawed democracy, and we're still proud that Malaysia has the best democracy in the world. But my question is, if our current government is still ruling the country after the next election, are we still have an opportunity to compete with the democratic countries like Turkey? Because this is our future. I'm not campaigning for the election. My second question is, and the related question is how to answer this assumption and the perception of the group of the people who says that democracy is not Islamic way in the current time. And my second question is, I'm not so clear on the Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab, because some references that his ideology is moderate, but his followers make it so extreme, and it looks like Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab mistake. So I need an explanation of that. Thank you.
Yeah, again, I will answer the second question first. I don't think you refer to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab, the person from Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, who is said to have founded the Wahhabi orientation school of thought. Of course, I said the person is said to have founded that because he did not claim to found a new school of thought, and his followers do not agree that they are Wahhabis or that they belong to a school of thought. They say that they are just explaining what Islam is and they are following Islam. And if a term is to be used, they describe themselves as Muwahidun, Unitarians, implying that they are returning to the fundamental principle of Islam. Now you are saying that, I suppose you are referring to those who are saying that the ideas of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab were corrupted by his followers. He himself was a reformer. Well, I think if you read his own writings, it's difficult to make that claim. Some of his views and some of his actions were extremist. He had a woman stoned to death. Of course, one apologist for him said that, he was a reasonable man because he told the woman not to do it. And she didn't listen, so finally he had to stone her to death. I don't think that's very reasonable. He conducted raids against Shiites. He considered Shiites as heretical. And the followers, of course, you know the story of the followers. They did the same thing. They also attempted to destroy the graves of the Prophet. In fact, they are still doing that. Of course, not the Prophet's grave, but other graves of Sahaba and other great saints in Islam, in Arabia, and monuments, homes, houses from the earliest days of Islam have been destroyed. Car parks have been built over that, shopping malls and all kinds of roads and so on. Now this relates to the idea to the earlier question about modernism, what I was saying about modernism. The present day Wahhabis are modernists in the sense that they reject tradition of Muslims, tradition of scholarship, of art, of literature, of Sufism, but also they're also modernists in the sense that they have taken the worst of modernity. The worst of modernity. Anyone who's been to Saudi Arabia can see that. Even in the area of the Haram, of the mosque, the Kaaba, and the mosque, you find that the traditional atmosphere, the traditional environment, the traditional built environment has not been respected. In Europe, you know that in many European cities there are laws about how high you can build within a certain radius of the old cities. You don't have that law, apparently you don't have that law in Saudi Arabia. So from Makkah, when you are in the Masjid al-Haram, you can see tall buildings, you can see modern buildings, clock towers, and all this kind of thing. Right? Again, no respect for tradition. The worst of Europe went through that period of, not respecting tradition in the 60s and 70s. But, because of conservation laws and return to tradition, these things, they stemmed they tried, because of various conservation movements, they stemmed the tide of this form of crass modernity. But Salafis, Wahhabis are examples of, crass modernity. First question on democracy and Islam. You are saying that some people say that democracy is not Islamic. Islam has no political system. Islam does not specify an economic system or a political system. There isn't such a thing as an Islamic economic system or an Islamic political system. Throughout Islamic, first of all, the Quran, neither the Quran nor the Prophet ever constructed an economic or political system. What the Quran did and what the Prophet did was to specify certain principles, certain broad principles of the economy and the polity. But those broad principles could exist within the framework of many kinds of political systems. The kind of political system that existed in the Prophet's time, and the kind of economic system during his time, was basically a pastoral, nomadic system outside the city, and within the city, more of a mercantile system. That system was a different system, right? But when Islam spread to Egypt and to Iran, to Iraq, when agrarian empires were established, the political system was different. The economic system was different. It was an agrarian economic system in Iraq and Iran and Egypt. The Ottoman system was also very different in terms of its politics and its economy. They were all based on Islamic principles, more or less. Certain Islamic principles can exist in a modern capitalist system. It can exist in a socialist system. Islamic principles of governance can exist in a democratic system, but it can exist also in a monarchy. Right? So there is no political system that is specified by Islam. Therefore, it is wrong to say that Islam is against democracy, or democracy is incompatible with Islam. It is more accurate to say that Islam would be against certain formulations of democracy. Islam would be against certain formulations of monarchies. But not to, we cannot say Islam is against democracy per se. I just also want to say that you are saying that if Malaysia failed, if the current government comes to power after the next election, then we cannot say we are democratic. Not so, because let's not confuse democracy with regime change. Right? We may continue to have the same government. It doesn't mean we're less democratic. The measure of a democracy is not whether there's regime change. We have to realize that however you might feel about the current government, in the last 5 years, in the last few years, particularly since Abdullah Badawi became Prime Minister, the political culture has changed. Partly because during his time, restrictions were lifted on the media. The media became a lot more freer than it was before his time. The fact that we can talk, and I've been in many forums where I've spoken or where I've been in the audience, when people are very critical and can speak critically against the government, already means a lot. Even if we cannot change the government, it already means a lot. This kind of thing that's happening now in Malaysia cannot happen in most Muslim countries. So we have to understand that, right? And what I'm saying has nothing to do with praising the government, right? Nothing to do with whether we agree with this government or not. The fact is, the political culture of this country is changing. It has been changing for the better, even if the government has not been improving. The political culture has been changing for the better, certainly during the last 5, 6, 7 years, and it might result in regime change or change in government in the future. Now, that change in government doesn't mean it's going to be a better government, right? But the point is, the political culture is changing. People are developing more of a democratic culture than was the case in the 1970s and the 1980s. The system was democratic in terms of the former trappings of democracy, regular elections every 4 or 5 years. But now, the political culture is catching up with that formal structure of democracy.
Thank you. Just a comment. I thought it was quite interesting when you mentioned how basically the Wahhabis had absorbed the worst of modernity. And from a personal experience, when I performed my Hajj in 2005, it's almost 8 years ago now. I don't know if it's still there, but there's a Burger King facing the Haram. And I mean, I'm not against Burger King, but you know, it didn't seem quite odd to me. Although I did go to eat there. I mean, you eat nasi Arab every day. You know. Okay, perhaps a final question. Sure. Before we wrap up.
I just have one question. You're talking about Reformation and Protestant Islam. Do you find in modern times the constant references to the Sunnah of the Prophet, every time an issue is raised, you go back to the Sunnah of the Prophet, do you find it is a handicap because we are referring to a time 1400 years back? Thank you.
Presentation. You spoke about the dangers of imposing interpretations on in general, and you spoke about, you cited how the example of Hinduism, or the term Hinduism being constructed by Christians and Westerners, Orientalists, and you sort of, if I can paraphrase correctly, you sort of called for a middle path to be seeked. Do you believe that middle path is already something that is in motion, that there is an interpretation that constitutes that middle ground, or do you believe that this is something that Muslims need to deliberately and consciously form and shape? And if so, would that conscious shaping of a middle path be, and when you warn against authority, so would that be an imposition of authority which would be sort of contradictory?
First, the question about Mr. Jumuboy's question about Sunnah. You more or less answered the question for me. You said you were going to reference the Sunnah rather than, I think, reference to the form of it rather than the Sunnah, rather than the essence of it. Yes, I mean, you're perfectly right. I'd just like to give an example to illustrate that. You know, talking about polygamy, you know, people like to, not people, but men, like to, you know, few wives, at least more than one. And especially when they are retiring and then they get their EPF, extra cash. And that happens to coincide with the time when their wife is old. Now the thing is, of course you can always refer to the Sunnah. I mean, the Prophet had many wives. But if you look at the Sunnah, of the practice of the Prophet in terms of the form of it, yes, he had several wives, he had more than 4 wives. And it was common for many of the prophets, you know, the biblical prophets had multiple wives. It was a part of the culture and the practice of those days. But if you were to follow the experience of the Prophet and the essence underlying his marital experience, then the people who engage in, who practice polygamy today are not following the Prophet. Because what is the real sunnah of the Prophet in terms of its essence, as far as marriage is concerned? First of all, he married a woman who was 15 years older than him. Which Muslim man today wants to marry a woman who is so old, so much older than him? Secondly, he was thoroughly devoted to his first wife, Sidi Khadija, until she died, and was very reluctant to take another wife after she died. But he was, prodded and persuaded by his companions for various reasons to take a wife after his first wife died. So, this aspect of the Sunnah, remain devoted to your wife who is older than you, and only take another wife if your wife dies before you do. Secondly, you have to, if you want to follow the Sunnah, you have to marry ugly women. Because the Prophet married fat and ugly women. And this is not an insult to the Prophet. I'm merely referring to what has been reported in the Sunnah, in the Hadith, in the Sirah, in the life history of the Prophet. One of the Prophet's wives is recorded in the life history of the Prophet to have been fat and slow moving. Because she was big. And nobody wanted to marry her. So the Prophet married her. See, nobody wanted to marry her. And marriage in those days was a sign of prestige. You were not, if you were not married, it wasn't good, right? So nobody wanted to marry her, the Prophet married her. So if you really want to follow the Sunnah, we should do this. Marry women that nobody wants to marry. So our men, I think today, they do not sacrifice themselves to that, right? They sacrifice. I don't know what kind of sacrifice that is. Maybe I suppose their sacrifice is that they have to compete or keep up with a young woman. They are 55, 60 years old. They marry a 25, 30-year-old woman. They have to keep up with that. It's maybe difficult, but maybe that's the difficulty, the sacrifice that they make. So if we really look at the Sunnah of the Prophet, at the essence, not in terms of the formal aspects of it, but the essence, then I think it's still relevant and there's a lot for us to learn. Have I answered? Oh, second half, okay. Okay, very quickly. Yes, about the middle path. We should not mystify this middle path. This middle path is not something that is elusive, something that we don't understand, that we have to articulate. It has been articulated by people in the past. It is being articulated by contemporary scholars. Some are even in Malaysia, many are in Indonesia, many are in other parts of the Muslim world. It's not difficult for us to know what the middle path should be. Take any area of life, whether it is economy, politics, culture, social aspects, any area of life, we can see examples of the middle path being articulated in theory. We can see examples of it being practiced in reality in different Muslim countries. And there are any number of Muslim scholars. Let's just take one issue. Is it permissible to stone somebody to death for adultery? There are any number of scholars, majority of them in fact, who will give you arguments to prove that it is not Quranic and it is barbaric to do so. And I'm not talking about secular, westernized Muslim scholars. I'm talking about traditional scholars. Only traditional scholars who are using robe and turban. Only thing is, we don't bring these people to Malaysia. We don't put them on the TV. We don't give them the exposure. That's the problem. So the problem is a political problem. The problem is competition. The ideas are out there. The progressive scholars are out there. Throughout the Muslim world. in Iran, in Turkey, in Egypt, in Syria, in Morocco, in Indonesia, not to mention Malaysia itself, right? The ideas are all out there. The progressive fatwas are out there, but we do not give them exposure. This is the problem in this country, and this country is very different from Indonesia in that sense. See, Indonesia, although they have problematic fatwas and they have problematic ruling, especially in Aceh nowadays, but for every problematic idea, there are opposing forces. There are scholars, there are ulama, there are politicians, there are reformists who are against these things. And these things are being hotly debated in the media. The scholars are writing. If you go to the bookshops in Indonesia, they're full of books written by Indonesians representing the full spectrum of religious ideologies. This is the problem in this country. We don't have that. You go to our bookshops, you don't see the full spectrum. You read the newspapers, you don't see too many progressive ideas. Right? Let me just give you one example. Shiism is being persecuted in Malaysia today. Shiites are being persecuted. When Shiites are persecuted in Indonesia, there are Sunnis who come to their defense. There's vigorous public debate. When Shiites are persecuted in Malaysia, there's no public debate. To add insult to injury, the media, last year, I think it was last year, there was a documentary on TV1, I think, two-part documentary that vilified the Shiites, that literally lied about Shiites, saying things like they have their own Quran and so on and so forth. These are the kind of things happening in this country. So if we don't have more forums like this, and more movements, like IRF, NGOs, independent organizations that propagate and promote a variety of discourses on Islam, if we don't do this, then we deserve what we get. We deserve this kind of understanding of Islam.